I will get us started with the discussion opener question. So this relates to the previous week's module, Module 4. And I'm wondering, why is it important for sponsors to meet the residency requirements? Thank you for that. It's important to have that support when they arrive in Canada. Yes, absolutely. Anyone else? I recognize, based on how you've been responding so far, that you may not be familiar with the term residency requirements. And so IRCC has expectations that the sponsors will live in the same community where the newcomers will reside. So with that understanding, why is that important? Yeah, for sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. If you're not located in the same place as where the refugee is going to reside, that makes it difficult, doesn't it? Yeah, that's a good point. The settlement agencies, they are funded for helping newcomers to Canada, but often they see that as newcomer government-sponsored refugees. Even though they are required to also help privately sponsored refugees, the line gets a little bit blurred sometimes because a lot of what a settlement agency does for government-sponsored refugees is what private sponsors do for their named refugees. And so we actually have a course specific for settlement professionals to take so they understand how to kind of negotiate that shared responsibility with private sponsors to be able to ensure that the newcomers' needs are met. But yes, absolutely, it would add strain to that settlement agency if the newcomers didn't have their private sponsors available to them. Does anybody else have anything else to add? Oh, I see there might be something in the chat. Yeah, important that the sponsors can fulfill their undertaking, the responsibilities. Now, I'm going to pose another question to you. And it's okay if you don't know the answer, but I'd like you to spend some time thinking about it. Why do you think we're focused on the sponsors meeting the residency requirements and not the refugees? Yeah, those are all great points. Yeah. Is there any other reason you can think of why we're focusing on the sponsors meeting the residency requirements instead of speaking about the refugees meeting the residency requirements? Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. You came up with what I was fishing for. I was looking for that kind of a response. Because often private sponsors think that because they are the ones who are providing settlement services for the newcomers, that they're assisting them, that the refugees will intend to stay where the sponsors are. But that's not always the case, especially if they don't know the sponsors. If you're sponsoring through the Blended Visa Office Referred program, where you're essentially sponsoring a stranger, and let's say the newcomer meets somebody on the airplane on the way to Canada who tells them, oh, you should come with me. I'm going to, let's say Kitchener, Ontario. I have a job waiting and I know they'll hire you too. Why wouldn't they choose to go, right? if their main concern is providing for their family, they know they can already come to Canada. They're going to go where the job is if they hear about it. And they can do that because they have the right that each of us in Canada do to choose where we're going to live. And they have the opportunity to move freely anywhere in Canada they want to. Now, granted, sponsors have been preparing long and saving money and doing everything they can to ensure that they will have a good settlement experience. So it's really important to communicate with them ahead of time as much as it is possible for you to do so, to let them know that it would be more difficult for them if they choose not to remain or to come to the intended community of settlement where their sponsors are, because the sponsors do provide that day-to-day help and they have knowledge about the location where they live because they live there themselves. But the truth of the matter is, some newcomers to Canada do move away from the area of settlement where the sponsors are, or sometimes they don't even show up. If they don't show up, it's called redestining. So they're choosing their own destination. And IRCC has certain things that they expect sponsors to do when those two things happen. So it's called secondary migration when they move from the intended community of settlement. Say they arrive there, they spend a few weeks there, they decide they want to move away. That's called secondary migration. If they don't even show up to the intended community of settlement, that's called redestining. And so you'll learn more about that throughout the course, but the important thing to keep in mind is that there are responsibilities that you still have even when the newcomers make those independent, autonomous decisions. And your responsibilities can be found in the post-arrival requirements document that will outline some of the things that you need to do. And you'll learn more about it. I'm not going to get too much into it right now because it's coming up later in the course, but just be aware when newcomers come to Canada for sponsored refugees, they have the same rights and privileges that we do as citizens, permanent residents who already live in Canada. And freedom of movement is one of them. Now, one of the things I didn't hear that I'm going to offer to you is, although the newcomers have applied for permanent residence and they've been accepted, that's not a contract that they've signed. They haven't signed a contract saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. When they get permanent residence, they certainly have obligations and responsibilities as a permanent resident in Canada. But the contract actually for bringing the newcomers to Canada lies with the private sponsors. So they have an agreement with the Government of Canada that they will provide settlement services and for the financial needs of the newcomers to Canada for 1 year after arrival. And that still stands if they choose to move somewhere else. So you have to try and make arrangements for when they do choose to leave and live somewhere else. Try and find replacement sponsors or representatives in that new community. And once you can demonstrate to IRCC that you've done everything you can to meet those residency requirements by finding replacement sponsors or representatives, and you've done everything you can to locate the newcomers, say they didn't even arrive where you were, but you did everything to try and reach them. At that point, IRCC may declare a breakdown in the sponsorship. And getting a breakdown declared by IRCC, it's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as IRCC determines that the sponsors did everything they could. They met their obligations to the point that IRCC expects, that they do their due diligence in trying to find replacements. However, if the newcomers leave because the sponsors did something wrong, it was unsafe for the refugees when they arrived. They didn't receive the money and support they were supposed to. And so they left, seeking support elsewhere. Then if the breakdown is declared as a fault of the sponsors, then that will have implications for your ability to sponsor again. So there are serious consequences and obligations and responsibilities that you have, even if the refugees choose to move away of their own independent thinking. Okay, let's get into the review of Module 4. So in Module 4, you learned who can be a private sponsor. And so private sponsorship is actually a group effort. Unlike family class sponsorships, individuals cannot be expected or solely relied upon to carry out the many tasks involved with settlement. Each person who intends to be a part of a sponsoring group must meet the following eligibility criteria to be a sponsor. They must be a minimum of 18 years old, and they must have either citizenship, permanent residence, or Indian status in Canada. As we talked about, they also must live in the same community of settlement as the arrived refugees. So they need to meet the residency requirements. And according to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, the IRPR 156A, some people cannot sponsor or help with sponsorship. And these are people who have committed a serious crime inside or outside Canada. For example, if they were found guilty of murder or a serious crime in the last 5 years. Now keep in mind, most people aren't aware that impaired driving or domestic abuse is considered a serious crime in Canada. And so those two will also prevent someone from being a private sponsor in Canada. And those who have not followed through on paying court-ordered spousal or child support. So if they owe money to their ex-spouse for child support or for spousal support, then they also cannot be a private sponsor. And anyone who has been told to leave Canada, so if the government said they must leave, that's what a removal order means, that they have lost their permanent residency, then they also cannot be a private sponsor. And of course, anyone who is in jail. So if they're in prison right now, they also cannot be a sponsor. Now, the sponsorship undertaking form, which is your contract with the Canadian government, it includes a promise from the sponsoring group, which simply means that they will make sure no one who could harm the refugees helps with their settlement. So you want to be sure that anybody who is unsafe to be a private sponsor will not be part of that settlement team. And for this reason, sponsors must carefully check all volunteers using the rules from the previous slide, because they are responsible for making sure refugees are safe, treated well, and have their basic needs met. So when we talk about who can be a private sponsor, there are 3 types of sponsorship groups that can privately sponsor refugees. In Module 4, you learned about sponsorship agreement holders, and they're fondly known as SAHs or SAHs. And some of those organizations partner with constituent groups and or co-sponsors. Now, constituent groups are basically entities or other organizations that are tied to them under the umbrella of the organization. So the best example I could give to you is for faith-based organizations. For example, the United Church in Canada. That title, United Church in Canada, is a national level organization, and they have churches all across Canada. So a church located in Toronto, Ontario, let's say it's called Toronto United Church, they are considered a constituent group of United Churches in Canada. So any organization that has, other members that are part of their organization that are located across Canada and report to them and are accountable to them, those would be considered constituent groups. Now, when we talk about co-sponsors are any individual or organization that would like to partner with the sponsorship agreement holder. And they are typically not organizations or individuals who are previously known or connected to the sponsorship agreement holder organization. So each of you would need to approach as a group to that Anglican diocese and say, we are a group of 5 that we want to do a sponsorship. Will you co-sponsor with us? And that makes it stronger for that sponsorship agreement holder. Because the sponsorship agreement holder would typically say, yes, I will co-sponsor with you, but you have to have a certain number of people sign the undertaking form. So if all 5 of you are willing to take that responsibility and sign the form, that makes it stronger to them, as opposed to only one of the people in your group signing that form. But let me keep in mind, and I'll remind everybody of this, each sponsorship agreement holder organization in Canada operates differently. They have their own internal ways of working with co-sponsors. So they may say, some of them may say, you have to have a minimum of 2 people signing on before we will agree to co-sponsor. Or they may say, you have to have all of the money up front for the sponsorship before we will co-sponsor with you. And each organization is different, and they may not have the same expectations when they work with co-sponsors. Okay, so getting back to groups of 5, a group of 5 is any individuals in Canada who want to work together. They can form a sponsorship group, and you can actually have more than 5 people sign on to the undertaking. They just expect that there will be a minimum number of 5 people working together. And of course, because there's an expectation that sponsors will live in the community of settlement where the refugees will reside, then of course those 5 or more people would need to be in general in the same area so they can support the refugees they're sponsoring. So you wouldn't have a situation where you've got one person in BC, one person in Manitoba, one in Ontario, and 2 people in Halifax looking to sponsor a refugee in Canada, right? You need to have the 5 people located in the community of settlement. If there's one person who, because of their job has to move away, they can still continue with the sponsorship, but they have to find a replacement in the community of settlement or a representative in the community of settlement. You would not, for example, be able to find 5 people who are willing to sign the undertaking and each of them find a representative in the community of settlement. It doesn't work that way. IRCC expects that the majority of the group of 5 members are going to be in that community of settlement where the refugee will reside. I can't tell you what fixed number that would be. Just know that the group of 5 needs to be in that same community, and where maybe 1 or 2 people for whatever reason can't be in that same community, then they can name representatives in that community. Okay, and moving on, we've got community sponsor groups. And so community sponsors may or may not work with co-sponsors. So some of them choose to, some of them choose not to work with co-sponsors. They just do sponsorships directly for individuals that they are aware of. And all of these sponsorship groups are essentially sponsoring people that are named, or they may sponsor UNHCR referred refugees through the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. When we talk about joint assistance sponsorships, only sponsorship agreement holders can become sponsors for that program. And I just want to quickly remind you that unfortunately right now, groups of 5 and community sponsorship groups, they cannot submit applications right now. The program has been paused until the 31st of December 2025. We have not received any word as of yet from IRCC whether or not they intend to resume application submissions in 2026 or whether the pause will continue. We haven't heard anything. So keep an eye on the IRCC website, just like we do. That's how we find out things usually, is when they make an announcement. So yes, that public policy is still in place. Now I want to talk about how sponsorship agreement holders are structured and how decision making happens within sponsorship agreement holder groups. So when making decisions in the SAW group, it's important to understand that each organization works in its own way, depending on how it's organized. So some sponsorship agreement holders may operate locally. So for example, a SAW may operate in the city of Calgary. Or there are some sponsorship agreement holders that work regionally. So perhaps they are an organization that looks after sponsorships in Eastern Canada, or they may work nationally. So these terms are used within the sponsorship agreement holders community and not necessarily by IRCC. However, IRCC does know if a particular sponsorship agreement holder has the resources to sponsor in different places across Canada or not. And an organization's applications will not be approved to sponsor in a location outside their area unless that they can show that they have enough money, so the financial capacity, and enough people in that location, like a constituent group or co-sponsors to handle the settlement tasks. So next we'll look at how decisions are made in the different types of SAW organizations. So a sponsorship agreement holder can choose different ways to organize and make decisions. In this structure, the sponsorship agreement holder handles all the sponsorship tasks themselves, including fundraising, managing the funds given to the refugees, and having a team to help with settlement activities. This is usually how a local SAW works, where decisions are made mainly between the sponsorship agreement holder and the sponsored refugees directly. So they don't work with constituent groups or co-sponsors. The second type of structure, the SAW may give some responsibilities to one of their constituent groups. But the SAW still has the ultimate responsibility since that organization has signed an agreement with the Government of Canada. A constituent group is usually part of the SAW's overall structure. And like the example I mentioned previously, a faith-based organization like the United Church in Canada, having many churches connected to it, and these churches are accountable to the national office that holds the SAW agreement. And similarly, a corporate organization with regional offices across Canada might engage in refugee sponsorships and be accountable to the head office that holds the SAW agreement. Now, these constituent groups can be given responsibilities such as providing funds and settlement support, or perhaps they will work in collaboration with the sponsorship agreement holder organization to provide funds and settlement team members. Now, a sponsorship agreement holder may have multiple constituent groups, and a CG could actually be responsible for more than one sponsorship. However, CGs should not make decisions about settlement support on their own. Decision-making should involve both the sponsorship agreement holder organization and the sponsored refugees. And remember, even if the constituent group has signed the sponsorship undertaking form, the sponsorship agreement holder is ultimately responsible. In this type of structure, the sponsorship agreement holder just works with individual co-sponsors who may be related to the refugees and will take care of the settlement activities, and in some cases, they will also provide the sponsorship funds. They may also work with co-sponsoring organizations like a cultural association, which may help with funding or volunteer support for the sponsorship. When working with co-sponsors, the sponsorship agreement holder may choose to only handle the application submissions, but it is also legally responsible for overseeing the settlement activities and the distribution of money to the sponsored refugees. Co-sponsors should not make decisions on their own about settlement support. So decisions should always involve both the sponsorship agreement holder and the refugees. And as we mentioned before, the sponsorship agreement holder is ultimately responsible, even if the co-sponsoring organization has signed the undertaking form. And it's for this reason that co-sponsors who work with sponsorship agreement holders have a lot of expectations and things they need to provide before an application will even be approved for submission by the SAW. And lastly, some sponsorship agreement holders choose to delegate settlement responsibilities to both constituent groups and co-sponsors who are working together. So in this example, the constituent group is working with a co-sponsoring organization that is providing the funds. Both the constituent group and the co-sponsor share the responsibility of providing people for the settlement activities. In this second example, the constituent group has two sponsorships they've submitted. For one, the co-sponsoring family members provide the funds, and both the constituent group and co-sponsors share settlement responsibilities. For the other, the constituent group provides the funds, and the sponsorship agreement holder and constituent group are working together to provide volunteers for the settlement. Perhaps the co-sponsor individual doesn't have funds for the sponsorship, and so the constituent group, church group, decides they're going to do fundraising for all of the funding. So the co-sponsor individual is simply signing on as a family member who is helping out, but the church group is deciding they're going to do the funding. And so, again, even when responsibilities are shared, the SAW remains ultimately responsible for the sponsorship. And so the sponsorship agreement holder should be involved in all decision-making and oversee settlement activities. And they should also stay in contact with the refugees directly to ensure they get the support they need and are part of the decision-making process. So when you work with a sponsorship agreement holder, you're not simply asking them to submit the application for you. They are directly involved in the sponsorship. And because they are ultimately responsible, there will be certain expectations and legal requirements that they have of you as the co-sponsor. For example, they may expect you to put all of the funds for the sponsorship in a bank account in trust before they submit the application. Now we're going to take a look at decision-making within the community sponsor group because they are fairly similar to the way a sponsorship agreement holder operates, especially if they work with co-sponsors. However, the difference between a community sponsor organization and a sponsorship agreement holder is that the community sponsor organization does not have to be incorporated for at least 2 years or have any previous sponsorship experience. Those are two of many requirements that a sponsorship agreement holder has to fulfill when they apply to become a sponsorship agreement holder. But the community sponsor organization, they simply need to be, recognized as an association. So have, the formal paperwork done that they are an association or organization, but they don't have to be incorporated. Similarly to the sponsorship agreement holders, that community sponsor organization is going to ultimately be held responsible because IRCC sees them as the primary sponsor. And when the community sponsor organization decides to work with a co-sponsor, the co-sponsors are additional group members. They aren't the primary sponsor. And so the community sponsor also is ultimately liable for the sponsorships it undertakes. So they too should always be involved in decision-making, even if they're not handling daily settlement tasks or providing funds. There should be a regular reporting system where co-sponsors update the community sponsor organization on their progress and any issues that they encounter. And the community sponsor should also meet refugees before they arrive and plan regular check-ins with the refugees without the co-sponsors present to get honest feedback about their well-being. And this process is similar to what sponsorship agreement holders are expected to do in their sponsorships. When it comes to decision making within the group of 5, so as I mentioned, 5 or more people can come together to privately sponsor a refugee, and all members of the group are considered by IRCC to be jointly and severally or solidarily liable, which means that they are responsible both as a group and individually for fulfilling their obligations. Even if they didn't agree to give funds for the sponsorship, they may be held responsible for providing funds to the refugees. So I'm going to explain that a little bit. For example, if one member of the group of 5 cannot provide their share of financial support, IRCC can ask any other member to pay the full amount. And that member can then try to recover the missing funds from the person who didn't pay what they agreed to pay. So keep in mind, the group is responsible both collectively as a unit to meet those financial needs of the refugees and individually for the entire sponsorship obligation. And so this is why it's important for all group members to be a part of the decision making. And the group must agree on how to carry out the settlement plan and choose one person to be the primary sponsor. Now, being the primary sponsor is basically the person who will create and submit the application in the permanent residence portal. And so it's wise to choose someone who is familiar with using computers and working online. But being the primary sponsor from the group does not make you more legally liable than the other group members. Each of you are equally liable. And so as a group of 5, you can choose to sponsor multiple refugees, but you must make sure you have enough funds for each sponsorship, especially if the sponsorship cases were to arrive at the same time. And the group of 5 doesn't have co-sponsors, but they are not limited to just 5 people. They can add as many people as they want to sign the undertaking form. Now let's talk about the application process for private sponsorship. If you recall in Module 4, you would have learned that there are 5 stages in total. Over the next few slides, we'll take a look at what happens at each of those stages. So during the pre-submission time period, there are 2 stages. So before you start working on the application, sponsors should first gather a committed team of eligible people. They should then connect with the RSTP to understand the type of sponsorship, the program they'll use, and how to create a plan detailing who, what, where, when, and how of the settlement process. So stage 1 involves 3 steps for initiating the sponsorship. The first step is to form a group. And when forming a group, consider reaching out to your local community. You may want to host an information session and invite community groups, friends, neighbors, local media, and leaders like the mayor or the member of parliament. The more people involved in supporting newcomers, the better their integration will be. You can use tools like a Facebook group or email newsletter to keep people updated and maintain interest during the long wait while the application is in process. You do want to be transparent about the process, including the time it may take, and make sure to find people who can commit to helping at every stage. Now, as we mentioned, community sponsors and sponsorship agreement holders or their constituent groups may choose to work with co-sponsor individuals or organizations. Co-sponsors are usually individuals in Canada who are family members of the refugees. And organizations could be associations like a soccer team or a community group that comes together. They could be considered co-sponsor organizations. Now, step 2 is to select a program. So the program you choose depends on whether you already have a specific refugee in mind. All sponsors can participate in blended visa office referred sponsorships or sponsor LGBTQ plus individuals through the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership with the Rainbow Refugee Society. However, only sponsorship agreement holders can sponsor refugees under the Joint Assistance Sponsorship, the JAZ program it's known as. And step 3 is to create the settlement plan. The settlement plan is important for getting approval from IRCC, so make sure it's detailed and well planned. And fundraising is also a big task and should start early to show IRCC that you already have the money in place and that it hasn't come from the refugees. In Module 5, you'll learn how to create a settlement plan, how to calculate the sponsorship costs, and apply any deductions. Now, stage 2 is gathering information and completing the forms. So when gathering supporting documents, refugees must provide documents demonstrating their need for resettlement to Canada. And sponsors must show proof of their financial ability. Many sponsors try to reduce costs by donating housing, furnishing, clothing, etc. But to have these donations recognized by IRCC, sponsors must keep receipts and official records showing the contact details for anyone who donates items. And supporting documents should be kept for the entire sponsorship and up to 2 years after they have arrived in Canada. Finally, with all of the previous steps underway or completed, completing the forms can actually begin. And you'll learn more about which forms are needed and how to submit the application in Module 6. But for now, we'll just review some of the general information about the forms in the next slide. So the PSR application process has 2 sets of forms, a set for the sponsors and a set for the refugees. And there are also 2 decision points made by IRCC for approval of each of these portions of the application. So the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, also known as ROCCO, approves the sponsors portion of the application. And the Visa Office Abroad determines the approval for the refugees portion of the application. And every application package should be checked before it's submitted to ROCCO to ensure that it is complete and filled out correctly. Simple things can be checked, like has everybody signed and dated their forms properly? Are there any missing forms or documents? Has each sponsor provided their own email address? Have you included translations and all supporting documents? Now, when it comes to blended visa office referred and joint assistance sponsorships, the refugees will have already been approved for resettlement. So only the sponsors' forms will be completed and then assessed by ROCCO once the sponsors are successfully matched with a refugee profile for these 2 programs. The last 3 stages occur after the application has been submitted. So stage 3 occurs in Canada. So in Canada, processing happens when private sponsors submit a complete application package through the Permanent Residence Portal and is received by the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa. When the application is received from the PR portal, an auto email is sent to all group members. And then ROCCO will first check if the sponsors' forms are complete. If anything is missing, the forms will be returned, and ROCCO will send a template email to the sponsors with all possible reasons for it being returned. However, if everything is in order, the sponsors will receive an acknowledgement of receipt, and a case number called a G number will be included with their approval to be sponsors. IRCC will then assess the sponsor's eligibility, including the settlement plan, financial documents, police checks, and ability to fulfill their responsibilities. If they're approved, the sponsors will be notified and the refugees portion will then be sent to the relevant visa office abroad. So stage 4 begins once the visa officer overseas receives the application. IRCC will review the refugee's eligibility and admissibility for resettlement to Canada, and they will either call the refugee for an interview or send a request by email, although in some cases, interviews may not be required. Sponsors should also expect to receive an email notice about the interview schedule and any additional documents requested by the visa office. This is to help you contact the refugee and ensure they don't miss any correspondence from the visa officer. And in some places, biometric data is collected for security screening and to confirm dependent relationships. IRCC will typically notify the refugees when they have been approved, and the sponsor should also be notified by email as well. However, they typically usually find out from the refugees first. Now, stage 5 begins when the refugee's permanent residence application is approved. Travel arrangements are then made. We'll discuss those in the next slide. And the International Office for Migration, also known as IOM, is the organization that's involved with this stage. So stage 5 begins when the refugee's permanent resident application is approved. And keep in mind that private sponsorship is actually a three-way partnership between sponsors and the refugees, sponsors and IRCC, and the refugees and IRCC. In the private sponsorship of refugees program, the International Office for Migration is responsible for assisting PSR refugees who are located in many countries who are on their journey to Canada. And in some cases, they may even assist with obtaining their medical appointments or exit visas. Once the PSR application is approved and the visa office overseas finalizes a case, IOM will arrange for the Canadian Orientation Abroad session to help refugees prepare for their journey and arrival in Canada. IOM will also typically assist with scheduling flights and obtaining the one-way travel documents for those who do not hold a valid passport. Refugees are advised to use IOM support, especially with flight changes, cancellations, and potential border restrictions that may occur. The refugees will receive assistance from IOM throughout their travel to Canada. So if they have layovers and need food or accommodations, or when flights are changed or canceled, IOM is there to help provide that assistance. The visa office will arrange for travel loans if refugees cannot afford to pay for the flights. And once in Canada, they must contact Collections Canada to defer payment until the end of their settlement year. So refugees who make use of that travel loan, they are expected to repay it, but they don't have to repay it until the end of their first year in Canada. Now, once travel has been confirmed, IRCC will issue what's called the Notice of Arrival Transmission, the NAT, and that will be issued approximately 10 days before their arrival. So that ends the review of Module 4. I just want to quickly review the important dates. And so we've already passed that first deadline of October 5th, where you had to have Modules 1 through 4 completed and the quiz submitted. I know some of you into a little challenges on the weekend, and you notified me to let me know that you may need an extension. So those who have been approved, those extensions have been granted. You do need to finish those submissions before 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow evening. Anybody who doesn't submit it by then, you will not be able to access Module 5 and continue with the course. So Wednesday is the next important date to pay attention to if you would like to review quizzes 1 through 4 to see where you might have made some mistakes. So we'll review the common errors made by those who submitted the quizzes. And so if you have not submitted all your quizzes, you will not be admitted to this review webinar, just to protect the integrity of those quizzes. And November 2nd is when modules 5 through 8 are to be completed and quizzes submitted. November 5th is when we'll review those quizzes. And the 9th of November is when the final exam is due. And we will review the final exam on the 12th of November. So that's it. I am going to take any questions. Yes, are you talking about the same Refugee family, like family unit, you're saying maybe the husband is in Cairo and the wife and children are in Kenya. Is that what you're saying? The general answer is yes, you can sponsor refugees from multiple locations. What I would say is that how the applications are processed may be different. So for example, a brother and sister, if they are adults and they're not dependent upon their parents, let's say one is 26 and one is 32. Just because they're brother and sister doesn't mean they can be on the same application. They'll have to have two separate applications and be processed separately. And so each of those applications, if one is in Kenya and one is in Cairo, they'll be assessed and approved individually. So they each have to have a refugee claim and be approved for resettlement to Canada independently. However, when we're talking about a family unit where there's a husband and wife and two children who are under 22 and those children aren't married, if the wife and two children are still, let's say, in the country of origin, let's say the whole family originates from Eritrea and the wife and children were left behind and the husband fled for reasons of persecution to Cairo, the husband is considered the principal applicant with the refugee story, and the wife and children would need to be included on his application. And the wife and children would be marked as non-accompanied or accompanied. You can choose. Accompanied would mean that you would like them to be traveling to Canada at the same time or within a reasonable period of time, say within weeks or a month of when the principal applicant travels. If you choose non-accompanied, then that means that they will come at a later date, or possibly not at all. If it's impossible for them to leave that country of origin, then they may not be able to come. But the principal applicant can travel to Canada on their own. There's a program called the one-year window of opportunity. That means that when the principal applicant arrives in Canada, they have 1 year to make an application to apply for the remaining family members to come to Canada. And so the wife and children who are still in Eritrea, as long as they're able to get out of Eritrea, then they can travel to Canada at a later date under that 1 year window of opportunity program. But regardless of whether they intend to come to Canada or not, whether they are missing or deceased, they must be included on that principal applicant's application. And so you'll learn more about that within the course, but that's to give you a rough idea. It's a good question. I'm glad you're asking. So the principal applicant who arrives in Canada and they want to bring their family members, they put the application through. But here's the catch. It's the original 5 group members from the group of 5 who are financially responsible and legally obligated to ensure that those remaining family members have sufficient money and settlement help when they arrive, because that is part of their original application. Those family members were listed and you're responsible for them because they're named on that application. And they have to be named on that application. So if the principal applicant doesn't have a job and can't financially support his family members, you as the group of 5 are legally responsible for providing the funds. Okay? Every family has to be able to leave the country they're in. So they have to be able to get an exit visa. If they can't get an exit visa, even if Canada approves their resettlement under 1 year window program, if they can't get an exit visa, there's nothing you can do about it. Canada can't get involved. It's the decision of the country of asylum or country of origin whether they issue exit visas or not. No, they can be resettled from Ethiopia. So as long as they can get the exit visa from Ethiopia, then they will be resettled from there to Canada. The only time it makes a difference where they have to leave if they are the principal applicant. because they can't be in their country of origin and be a refugee, right? You become a refugee once you cross the border outside your country of origin. Your family members become eligible by you being approved as a refugee for resettlement. So the principal applicant has to leave the country of origin. Their family members do not, but the family members do have to be able to get an exit visa at some point. If you think about it, the refugee situation hasn't changed, has it? Other than that they're now pregnant. So they've actually become more vulnerable than they were before they were pregnant. So it's an unexpected additional expense that the sponsors will have to consider whether they're willing to accept or not. They have the ability to withdraw the application if they want to, but from a humanitarian perspective, is that the right thing to do, to withdraw an application because somebody got pregnant? I think that the way to go forward with integrity is to do what you can to raise the extra money, because you will be responsible for the additional child when they come to Canada, when they're born. So when you make a decision to sponsor someone, life happens, and it takes a long time for them to arrive in Canada. So if you intend to sponsor someone who is 20 years old, and it takes 4, maybe 5 years before they'll arrive, well, how many 20-year-olds do you know will remain single and childless after 5 years? The chances are pretty good that they will probably find someone, get married, and have kids. So before you submit the application, explain to the group members, this is reality, this is what might happen. We should be prepared to pay for the additional family members if that happens. You do have the chance, though, to withdraw the application at any time. But keep in mind, when you withdraw an application, IRCC may not see that as a legitimate reason for withdrawing, simply because you cannot come up with the funds. And they may restrict you from sponsoring in the future if that's your only reason that you can't come up with the funds, because it does take years for them to come. But there is that option to withdraw the application. Yes, they do. They have a cap. So every year, sponsorship agreement holders are given what is called an allocation. So a portion of the global levels numbers are given to sponsorship agreement holders. So in 2025, that total number for all sponsorship agreement holder organizations was only, I believe, 10,500 people. And we have over 140, probably close to 150 sponsorship agreement holder organizations. And so depending on their experience and the financial capacity and ability to sponsor refugees, that allocation is divided among those sponsorship agreement holders. Some of them only have 25 spots. Some of them have hundreds of spots, allocations, each year. But they have to use those allocations in every year. And truthfully, most sponsorship agreement holder organizations already have long waiting lists of people wanting to do private sponsorship. So it is very difficult to find a sponsorship agreement holder to work with. I have to be transparent about that. Many of them have already had their allocations for 2025 assigned, probably even before they received them this year. But they will be issued new allocations for 2026. They don't know how many they're going to get. If the government reduces the number that they give to them overall, then there'll be less that they have to work with. Yes and no. The only way they can sponsor others if they choose to sponsor under the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. And the reason for that is because they don't have to use an allocation for Blended Visa Office Referred refugees. There's no allocations for that. But you, as a family member of a refugee overseas, you can't refer your family member to the BVOR program. That's not how it works. Blended Visa Office referred refugees are referred by UNHCR to the Canadian government. And so sponsorship agreement holders can have one of their constituent groups choose to sponsor a refugee that's unknown to them, and they do that through BVOR, and it doesn't require allocations. But when we talk about privately sponsored refugees, the ones that are named, they can't sponsor any more than the allocations they have. They'd have to wait till the next year with new allocations given. So when the organization first applies to become a sponsorship agreement holder, they have to provide proof of their financial capacity. So they have to provide audited financial statements that CPA, the Chartered Professional Accountants, do that audit, which costs a lot of money. And they have to, provide their professional opinion that the organization operates in a fair way, that their statements are a fair representation of how their funds, move and flow through their organization, whether they pay their bills, whether they have good governance structures in place and accountability structures in place. That's what the audit does. And the sponsorship agreement holder has to submit that when they apply to become one. So IRCC can tell, based on all of the documents they submit at that time when they make their decision, whether or not they'd have the financial capacity and the manpower to do sponsorships just in a local area or across Canada. Because of course they would describe in their application whether they have, members of their organization who are located in different provinces in Canada, for example, different churches across Canada. But if they're just one organization, say it's a soccer association in Canada that wants to become a sponsorship agreement holder, and they, have been incorporated as an association for 2 years, then they will only operate within that general city, that vicinity. And IRCC knows this. They have basically a profile of each sponsorship agreement holder and what, at the time of application, they were able to prove they could sustain over the long term. In addition to that, it's the sponsorship agreement holder's responsibility to pre-screen any co-sponsors and constituent groups they're going to work with. So they may ask the co-sponsors and constituent groups to provide financial profile forms showing that they have the financial capacity to meet that funding that's required. And some of them simply don't even do all that. They ask for the money up front that gets deposited into a funds held in trust account. So yeah, they operate differently, but IRCC knows the type of capacity based on when they first became a sponsorship agreement holder, what they're capable of. And they also take a look at the history, right? So if a sponsorship agreement holder has failed to meet their financial commitments for any of their sponsorships, that's going to be kept on record, on file against the SAW, and they may be put into a category called not in good standing. And they have to submit financial documentation at that point to prove their financial capacity with every application. Whereas most SAWs, it's a blanket understanding that they do, so they don't have to submit financial documentation to IRCC with their applications until they show otherwise, that they have not met their commitments, and then they're put in that special category. You'll learn more about that upcoming in the course as well. So if we're still talking about sponsorship agreement holders, a community group can become a co-sponsoring organization for a sponsorship agreement holder. It is the sponsorship agreement holder themselves. They determine what their capacity is, and as long as they can demonstrate they have the financial capacity and they have the structure and reporting things in place, then IRCC will generally approve their applications. But for example, if it's a small organization that has no other membership across Canada, so for example, if you're not, a church organization with churches across Canada, or you're not a Canadian organization that has departments across Canada. So if you have no people on the ground in different areas across Canada, IRCC is not going to approve your applications as a SAW to sponsor people outside of your local region. So IRCC is aware of which organizations are large enough and have the financial capacity to work with constituent groups across Canada. But those who aren't large enough and don't have the capacity, they won't generally operate that way. They generally just do sponsorships within their city or maybe the province if they are larger than that. Yep, it can be tricky because once the money is designated for a sponsorship, it has to remain there. And if they want their money back and they want out of the sponsorship, then you have to request a withdrawal. And if that happens, IRCC will not look fondly upon that decision to withdraw because somebody wants their money back. So my advice to you is only do group of 5 sponsorship with people you know and trust and you know are going to be committed to seeing it through to the end and not request money back because they changed their mind. Now, I know life happens and serious situations happen. For example, one of your group members may lose their job, and that is money that they would need to live on for their own family because they have no other source of income. That's a different story. And explaining that to IRCC will, make a difference. But in most cases, it becomes a challenge. IRCC doesn't look fondly on sponsors who change their mind simply because they don't want to fund it anymore. Oh, I see. You're talking about IRCC rejected one of the applications where someone applied under the 3,000 spots that were available for refugees under public policy. They'd have to reapply, right? If they didn't get accepted under the public policy, then you have to reapply under private sponsorship in general. Hopefully that answers your question. So every application that comes to IRCC gets submitted through the permanent residence portal, and it's a first in, first out. So basically, when your application gets submitted, say it's at 10 o'clock, and the next person's application is at 10:01. This could be a sponsorship agreement holder. This could be a constituent group of 5. It doesn't matter. It just depends on the timing of when it gets submitted. And they process it in order. The difference, I would say, where first in, first out doesn't work anymore is the difference between a more complicated case than a straightforward case. So when I say complicated case, if somebody has a criminal history that needs to be investigated, or security concerns or medical screening that may take longer, then that would delay their application and other applications would be bumped up ahead of theirs simply because of what's involved with, processing their application. The other example is when public priority, ministerial priorities take place. So for example, recently Sudan and Afghanistan refugees, they had public priority for a certain number. I think that's the 3,000 someone was referring to. People could submit for up to 3,000 spots for refugees to come to Canada quickly. So they get expedited because of the nature of the immediacy of protection that's needed. And so when we saw with Afghanistan, people were trying to flee en masse in getting them on airplanes quickly because of what was happening there. So when the Minister of Immigration makes a public policy decision to provide an exemption through the normal process, then those applications get bumped to the top. And of course, what does that mean? Those who have been processed for a long time already, they're delayed a little bit because of that. So those are the ways that applications get out of sequence from the original submission, first in, first out processing. And I should add one more example. There are situations where refugees overseas are pending immediate deportation, so their lives are at risk, at threat, because they're being forced back to the country where they're being persecuted. if IRCC is notified, then they may expedite urgent processing for those cases, and they may get bumped to the top because of the danger that those individuals are in. Or anybody who has a severe medical condition that simply being resettled to Canada will give them that life-saving care that they possibly can't get in the country of asylum because it's not accessible to them, then it might be expedited in that case. I recall when I was a sponsorship agreement holder, we had a family who had a 6-year-old that had a urinary tract infection. And when you think about that, it seems like such a simple medical diagnosis that just needs antibiotics for treatment. It couldn't be treated. She had it for 6 months ongoing, and it was becoming critical. And they had doctors' diagnosis and a report that they submitted to IRCC, and that family got expedited because that child likely wouldn't have survived without the medical treatment available to them here in Canada. So those are the other instances where applications are expedited, and it's upon the prompting of the sponsors to provide IRCC with the information once that happens, if those things occur. You can certainly link the two applications together, and you can indicate in the settlement plan that the intention, because the family requests it, that they intend to live together, they want to live together. And so you can, after arrival, reduce some of the costs, the shared costs, but only for certain things. So, for example, the shelter could be reduced as long as through one of the family units, the full cost of rent is covered, right? So there can't be a shortfall in the rent by reducing the cost of the other family unit. So the other thing I would say is that you have to be prepared for the reality that families get into arguments and fight, and they may no longer want to live together. So you have to explain in your settlement plan that although they intend to live together, you are prepared to provide funds for 2 separate residents if that occurs. And not only for that, but I can't stress this enough, people don't realize that dependent children who are 18 years old when they arrive in Canada, they automatically are seen by IRCC as adults who are entitled to their own settlement funds. So even though they come to Canada under their parents' application, once they land in Canada, if they are 18 at that time, or if they turn 18 during that first year of settlement, they have a separate amount of money, and it's $16,500 minimum for that dependent who's 18. So if you have anybody that you're submitting an application for where the dependent children are close to 18, say they're 16 or 17, be prepared that when they arrive, because the application process can take 3-4 years, they will be 18 and you're going to be required to provide more money, even if they live with their family. They're entitled to their own settlement funds. Now, they can share some costs, but the reality is IRCC expects you to have enough money in place if that 18-year-old decides they don't want to live with their parents anymore. So not only are you looking at a separate accommodation and funding for the grandparents if they decide to live on their own, you also have to be prepared for that 18-year-old to move out and live on their own, and you'll be responsible for them. The only time that isn't going to happen is if there's a breakdown in the family relationship and a divorce happens. Then IRCC expects you to choose to be responsible for the most vulnerable portion of the family, right? So the one that is in greater need of settlement support and assistance. You won't be responsible for both parties once that divorce happens. Okay, great conversation. I apologize for it going over, but I feel like it was worthwhile time spent answering those questions you had. They were really important ones to talk about.